I've got it. So I was like, no. All set? All right. So again, thank you for having me. It is my first time serving here. I usually serve at the Wildwood as well as Swampscott and a couple of other spiritualist churches. And I'm pleased to, it's like it's taking me this long to get here. So thank you very much. Today I wanted to talk about a couple of different concepts. They all come together, so bear with me. It's going to be one of those roundabout stories where I segue all over the place, but if you know me, that's me. Mother's Day is coming up, and a lot of people will talk about the love of mother and the nurturing aspect and women, and I agree with that absolutely and completely. I always feel like I'm leaving the men out, though, because there are some men who are the mother figures in their family, or are the nurturing ones, and to say otherwise is to assume that all men have that toxic masculinity and that they can't have that nurturing sense about them. So this really is bigger than just Women and Mother's Day or Fathers and Father's Day. It's about the nurturing aspect and the love and standing up for other people and their rights and their inane rights. That unconditional love we talk about with spiritualism. So I wanted to talk today about Victoria Woodhull. Does anyone know who Victoria is? All right, we've got one in the group. Excellent. So to do this, I want to go back just a little bit and talk about the beginnings of spiritualism, just to give you a little backstory. So most people agree, most historians agree that spiritualism as we know it, modern spiritualism, began around 1848 in Hydesville, New York with the Fox sisters. Now, most people are familiar with the Fox sisters and the tappings and the rappings. They became the first mediums, the first people accredited with speaking to spirit through a design system of taps, knocks, answering questions back and forth. And they became a phenomenon within the country, and soon there were mediums on every corner. It really took off. And of course, the 1840s were primed for spiritualism because Emanuel Swedenborg, who was an 18th century philosopher, began to change people's concepts about heaven so that it was no longer this faraway, sterile place, you know, the guy sitting up in the cloud with the beard judging everyone, but it became a more perfect version on earth where spirits still lived on, and they lived among us, even if we didn't see them. So it was ripe for that sort of idea that there are still spirits here with us that could communicate with us. It was very well received. So, like traditional religions, spiritualism believed in the immortality of the soul. We've talked about this, that spirits live on. We live on. We don't die when our bodies die. Unlike traditional religions, it did not call for blind faith. And this was a big thing for a lot of people at the time, where your traditional churches said, you will believe this is the doctrine, this is the way it is, and nothing else exists. So this was, for a lot of people, the idea that there was proof, evidence of life after death, the evidence that God existed, which the church would not give you. You just have to have faith. And I'm not knocking any church. Please don't think that I'm saying any religion is right or wrong. It's completely personal, but this was really appealing to a lot of people. Prove to me. Show me. You know, show me that there's something. Show me that I'm doing this for a reason. Show me that my mother is still existing, that she's in heaven with Jesus like you tell me she is. I want to know this. I need to know this, to believe fully, to really invest myself in this. So it was a beautiful thing at the time, and it was very well received, all of these mediums. Also at the time, spiritualism rebelled against the modern, the way things were, the standard, with radical individualism, which at the time, unheard of. It was an individual look that spiritualism was the sole religion at the time that saw women as equals. So personal responsibility, not the book tells you you can't, not God says you'll be punished. Personal responsibility, you know right and wrong, do what's right. And at the time that was unheard of. It was doctrine. Doctrine says, dogma says you must do this or you will be punished. It's wrong, it's bad, and God will. And again, I'm not judging any other religion as good or bad, more to say what was happening at the time. So people wanted mediums. People wanted mediumship. People wanted proof. And it only continued on from there. So for a while, spiritualism, and this is where it segues into Mother's Day and mothers and women in general and people in general, because at the time, spiritualism was the only way women were allowed to speak in public. Now think about that. Imagine not even being allowed to publicly speak because of your gender or your age or any other number of things. It's not just about, I want to make this clear, this is not just about women, because as well, you know, we all know that women couldn't vote. At the time, a lot of men couldn't vote. If you didn't have own land, you weren't allowed to vote either. So this is not a women's issue. If you're a person of color, you might not be allowed to vote. This was not just a women's issue. This was a people and equality issue. This was an unconditional love issue. This was inherent rights issues. So we're acknowledging these people. So the downside of having women suddenly being allowed to broadcast and speak in public as speakers and being accepted in that platform, if you will, was that they, call it a downside, call it an upside, I'm not really sure how you want to call this. They used this to champion their ideas of women's suffrage, equal rights, abolition of slavery, and they claimed that their messages were coming from the spirit realm. We should let women vote because spirit tells me this is the right thing to do. We should abolish slavery because spirit tells me this is the right thing to do. Was it really spirit? Was it really them? No one really knows. And anytime you look back in history, the Fox sisters, the Eddy brothers, any of these number of spiritualist leaders, there's always a lot of drama and always a lot of wonderings around them, scandal around them. Was it true? Was it real? Can you prove it? Was it faked? And here we come back to blind faith again. Here we come back to experiential. When you have experienced something and you know it to be true, no one will shake your resolve. But if I tell you ghosts exist or spirits exist or aliens exist, until you experience that, my word is not going to sway you. So here we are at a time again where women are allowed to speak, and they use this platform for social justice, for the good of the world, for all of humanity, not just for women's rights. And this is where we come to Victoria Woodhull. Victoria Woodhull was a vocal spiritualist and the first woman to run for president. No one knows about her. No one even knows her name. Everyone thinks Hillary Clinton. Victoria Woodhull was the first woman. She was also one of the first female stockbrokers in the country. Again, at a time when women weren't even allowed to speak publicly. She was a stockbroker in New York. So some of the words used to describe Victoria publicly were impudent witch, vile jailbird, and her most famous, Mrs. Satan. Those are the words that were used to describe her and her belief in spiritualism, suffrage, and the ideas of free love, which were seen as threats to the traditional morals of the time. Can we see the parallels between what's going on in our world today with so many things changing? And people talking about different rights. Who has rights? Who doesn't have rights? Why should they have rights? Why shouldn't they have rights? And it all began, we're talking the 1800s now. So she was the first woman to run for president, way ahead of her time. And she was also the target, obviously, for ridicule among her contemporaries because she was outspoken. Oh, God forbid! God forbid a woman get up and speak her mind publicly. Oh. So she made her bid for the highest office in the nation in 1872 as a nominee with the Equal Rights Party, a full 136 years before Hillary Clinton launched her first campaign. And Woodhull's life was a rich tapestry of marriages, scandals, rabble-rousing, and activism. And again, you can't, it seems, have a spiritualist leader without having all of these things as well. So she was born in Homer, Ohio, English first language, to indigent parents. Victoria California Claflin was her name. And she spent much of her childhood at the mercy of her father's money-making schemes. So we can see where some of this kind of comes into play. With less than 3 years of formal education, she worked as a child preacher, a fortune teller, a clairvoyant, and a magnetic healer. So now, was this all because of her father, who was a scamster, or was this because she was in touch with her own spiritual nature and understood these things could happen? No one knows. We just know that she did it. So before her first marriage at age 15, to the disreputable Canning Woodhull, an alcoholic morphine addict, and a serial adulterer. She had 2 children with Woodhull before eventually divorcing him, although she kept the name the rest of her life. So she's not had a great life up to now. It's been full of a lot of drama and other such things, and how she could ever manage to rise to the highest level trying to run for president, from humble beginnings. So in 1866, she married spiritualist and Civil War hero Colonel James Blood. And this also ended in divorce, but the union would end up being serendipitous for Woodhull. Because in 1868, Blood encouraged the Woodhills and her sister Tenny, 6 years her junior, to move to New York, where Blood lived part-time. So they ended up getting a house there, and through social circles, coincidence, she managed to meet the railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he hired them as his personal spiritualists. Now, there's no record in here of where she found spiritualism, probably through her husband Blood at the time, but clearly she was practicing by this point in time. So he agreed to fund a brokerage firm helmed by the sisters. And this is where she became the stockbroker. She has a philanthropist here who's willing to support her financially. And again, without that kind of backing, a woman at that time would never have risen to this level. So it's fortuitous that they did meet him. There were claims that her sister was actually engaged in a relationship with Vanderbilt, never proven. But again, you can't have these figures without the scandal. I think the scandal makes them a little bit more spicy, don't you, though? I like to have a little bit of color in that, with so it's not the straight-laced, So, I mean, Mother Teresa's fine, don't get me wrong, but having that little bit of color in there just makes them more interesting. So they opened the firm Woodhill, Claflin & Co. in Manhattan's Broad Street in 1870. So, again, one of the first two lady stockbrokers in the limelight. In the New York papers, they were dubbed the Lady Bankers and the Bewitching Brokers, and they allegedly made $700,000 their first 6 weeks in business, which today's money would be $13 million. So that's a lot of money. Granted, they've got the Vanderbilt name backing them. Still, a lot of people would say, woman run? I'm not taking a chance on that. So the profits allowed the sister to found their own newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, and in their publication they advocated radical 8-hour workdays. Can you imagine? Gender and radical equality, sexual education for teenagers, and many of the views espoused in the paper were still considered progressive today, more than a century after the fact. And at the time, these were radical thoughts. 8-hour workdays, lazy. Why would you only work 8 hours when you can work them 12 or 14? Come on now, unproductive, un-American. So in January of 1871, Woodhull became the first woman to appear in front of the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, advocating for women's suffrage and arguing that nowhere in the Constitution did it say women cannot vote. Woodhull was a gifted orator, unlike me, and her appearance caught the attention of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, catapulting Woodhull onto the national stage. So we all know Susan B. Anthony. We all are familiar with that name as far as women's rights go, but Woodhull is largely forgotten, erased from history. So on the strength of her now, newfound notoriety, she announced that she was going to run for president in 1872 as a candidate for the Equal Rights Party, which she and her sister founded. Again, more than just I'm running for president, I'm founding a party to run with as well. The amount of paperwork, time, and effort, because you can't just, as a woman, couldn't go into town hall and say, I want to start this party. And they would say, oh, okay. The amount of uphill battles they had just to create each and every step along the way is worth mentioning. This was not an easy venture by any means. She sold out venues like Steinway Hall and the Academy of Music in New York, declaring herself a free lover. In one of her speeches, cartoonist Thomas Nast dubbed her as Mrs. Satan, and that name stuck ever since. They depicted her with demonic horns and wings, holding a document saying, be saved by free love. And we need to define here, free love for Woodhull meant woman's freedom to marry, divorce, and bear children without government interference. It does not mean that they're all out in the street, So again, but the way that they are portrayed in history always kind of wants to change that, make it a little spicier. So let me go back here. Where were we? It seems unlikely that she ever thought she would actually become the president. I mean, she was a realist, even despite all things, but she had to push for it. She wanted that to be an option for women going forward, and someone has to be the one to break the ice. So we think that was really more of her goal for this, was to make the issues front and center. She named Frederick Douglass as her running mate, but there's no proof that Douglass ever accepted or even acknowledged the nomination. Good for her. So largely it was, I won't say that it was a political or a marketing move necessarily, but it was paving the way for the rest of us coming after her. So, as I said, largely she's been forgotten in history. She spent election night in 1872 in New York's Ludlow Street jail after publishing a salacious, but most likely true, gossip she'd heard from Cady Stanton accusing Brooklyn preacher Henry Ward Beecher, who is the brother of famous abolitionist Uncle Tom's Cabin author Harriet Beecher Stowe, of adultery with a married woman. Beecher Stowe as a result of this, is now the source of the words impudent witch and vile jailbird comments that were later used to describe her. So the story gets even more twisted because she was so incensed that Woodhull would publicly smear her brother. Again, not sure if any of that is the accusations are true, but there they are. So Anthony Comstock, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, made it his personal mission to suppress any ideas the Kaplan sisters came out with. So he was out to get them, and he had them arrested 8 times within a 6-month period. And again, understand that this is no small thing. There's fines involved. There's a lot that goes into this. It's not just we grab you, we stick you in jail, and you get out the next day. So at the end of all of this ordeal, they were bereft of friends and allies and nearly broke from all the money I'm sure they had to pay in fines and fees. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, his heirs may have paid the sisters to move to England so they wouldn't be present to contest his will, conveniently. In any event, both sisters married rich members of the landed gentry on the other side of the pond, where they spent the last thirds of their respective lives. So it all worked out for them in the end anyway, and there's a lot of spiritualists in England as well. I'm sure that they found a community they could fit right into. Woodhull died in 1927. Today, Woodhull has been all but erased from our history books. Most people don't know her name or know that she was the first woman who ran for president. And I bring her up, again, not for women's rights. This is not to talk about suffragettes or rights that women have had. At that time, children were used as slave labor. Slavery was still around. As I said, the workday was not 8 hours. There were no unions. There were no workers' rights. You were at the mercy of someone who had more money than you. And if you didn't own property, you were at the mercy of your employer. You were at the mercy of society. You were at the mercy of the government to have or to raise your family the way that you wanted to. And so the fact that spiritualism married in with that concept, and we see that today, that we are the people who try to be open-minded about different people, different ways of being, different ways of seeing yourself, or different ways of connecting with God. I have friends that are Baptists. I have friends that are born-again Christians. I have friends that are just about every denomination in the world. Be what you are. That's fine. I will never tell them your religion is wrong, your way of thinking is wrong, your way of being is wrong. I have friends who are transgender. I have friends who are gay. I don't care. It's none of my business. They're not sleeping with me. So the spiritualists have long held this idea that all people are equal. All people are the children of God. We are the ambassadors of spirit. We are here embodied to be the ones that help raise others and light the light for them. And we are so fortunate. And as a medium, I can tell you how many messages I have received from spirit, from grandmothers or great-grandmothers saying, I am so glad you have opportunities I did not have, because going to college wasn't an option back then. You could be a secretary, if you were allowed to work at all, or you could work in a school. But if you worked in a school, you weren't allowed to marry. That's it. Those were your options. Or you could just be a stay-at-home mom. That was preferable. That was the life for a woman back then. And again, I'm not saying that men didn't have their share of issues too. The idea that you are the provider, suck it up, drive on, go to work, even if you have cancer, even if you're dying, even if you're hurt, doesn't matter, you've got a family to provide for. It wasn't a very compassionate time to live. And we grow more and more compassionate, I feel, as we get further and further on down the line, and we always have our own, there's always a new issue. Well, this thing has come up, I don't know, that goes against what I was raised with, that goes against my, but being spiritualists, we stop and we think, but why? Were these beliefs passed down to me by my parents? Or are these things I've decided to believe in? You know, a lot of people talk about the Bible. The Bible's the holy book. Well, why? Have you read it? Do you agree with it? And I'm not saying you shouldn't, or I'm not saying you should. But it should be your decision. I choose to believe, or I choose not to believe. We are all here because we chose to be spiritualists. Even today, it's still very rare that you see families of spiritualist children born into families and raised as spiritualists. Most people come to spiritualism as adults because we choose. We choose. I prefer to think this is closer to what I believe than the doctrine I was getting where I was or what I was finding where I was. And again, not good or bad, just what is. And partially it's because it welcomes open-minded people who recognize that everyone has their own thing going on. Everyone has their own suffering going on in some way. Not just women's rights, not just children's rights. They didn't know what autism was back then. That's a big thing these days. You know, there's always that. And my father-in-law, God bless him, is an older generation. He doesn't understand why my autistic nephew can't just do what he's told. Why can't he just go get a job? When I was 18, I went out and got a job. he doesn't work that way. And it's not, believe me, it's not because I'm lenient with him and I give him, he literally is not wired that way. And it's taken a lot of work to bring him to the place where he needs to understand he needs to be self-sufficient. We're learning to be compassionate and deal with new ways of being and seeing people. And Victoria was one of the founders of that. She was one of the forefront who said, we need to recognize all people have rights, regardless of their gender. Everyone needs to be treated fairly and equally. And I love the fact that she used spiritualism to do that. And I hope that we will continue to use spiritualism as a platform for bringing all peoples together and ensuring that everyone is seen and heard and allowed to be who they are. I'm not suggesting we have special rights for everybody, but everyone should be allowed to be who they are, unapologetically. So thank you, Victoria, and I will leave you with that.